your fuel, your electricity, your job, and maybe even your future could depend on it. The Strait of Hormuz. Every single day, nearly one-fifth of the world's oil flows through this tiny corridor between Iran and the Gulf states. And right now, the world is holding its breath. Because if Iran decides to close it, the global economy could collapse overnight. Gas prices could explode. Stock markets could crash. Factories could shut down. Airlines could ground flights. Entire governments could start panicking. And millions of ordinary people, people who have never even heard the word Hormuz, would suddenly feel its consequences. But here's the thing, this story isn't just about oil, it's about power, fear, revenge. And what happens when a wounded nation realizes it still has one final weapon that can shake the entire planet? This is the Strait of Hormuz gamble. For decades now, the Middle East has been the beating heart of the global energy system. And right at the center of that heart is a choke point so critical that military strategists call it one of the most dangerous places on earth, the Strait of Hormuz. To really understand why this matters, you first need to understand one brutal truth about modern civilization. The world runs on energy. Not ideals, not speeches, not hashtags. Energy, the lights in Tokyo, factories in China, planes in America, data centers powering artificial intelligence. All of it depends on energy moving smoothly through global trade routes. And one of the most important routes on Earth passes directly beside Iran. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. At its narrowest point, it's only about 21 miles wide. But despite being so small, this tiny passage carries around 20 million barrels of oil every single day. That's oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and Iran itself. Tankers move through this corridor non-stop. If the strait shuts down, global oil supply instantly tightens, and markets panic. Because modern economies don't just fear shortages, they fear uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads faster than war itself. A single missile, a naval mine, one drone strike could send oil prices skyrocketing overnight. And history shows us just how fragile this region really is. Here's something Iran understands deeply: it cannot overpower the United States militarily. It cannot outspend Saudi Arabia. It cannot outgun NATO. It cannot dominate global finance. But Iran doesn't need to defeat the world directly. It just needs to make the cost of attacking Iran unbearably high. That's the strategy, and the Strait of Hormuz is the centerpiece. For decades, Iranian leaders have quietly built what military analysts call an asymmetric deterrence strategy. What does that mean? It means if Iran gets cornered, it can hurt everybody, not by invading countries, but by disrupting the arteries of global trade, fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles, sea mines, drones, proxy militias. Iran has spent years preparing for exactly this scenario, because Tehran knows something terrifying: the world economy is incredibly vulnerable, especially when energy prices spiral out of control. Let's imagine it actually happens. One morning, news alerts explode across the world. Iran declares the Strait of Hormuz closed. Oil tankers stop moving. Insurance companies panic. Shipping firms halt roads. Military fleets mobilize. Within hours, oil prices surge. By 150 a barrel, then 200, maybe even higher. And suddenly everything becomes more expensive. Gasoline, food, electricity, transportation, manufacturing, inflation explodes globally. And remember, many countries are already drowning in debt, already struggling with inflation, already politically unstable. This is why economists fear energy shocks so much, because energy affects British Island. When oil prices rise sharply, food becomes expensive, shipping becomes expensive, air travel becomes expensive, construction becomes expensive, even your internet becomes more expensive, because the physical infrastructure of civilization depends on energy. And then comes the psychological effect: fear. Investors dump stocks, banks tighten lending, businesses stop hiring, consumers stop spending. Suddenly, a regional conflict becomes a worldwide economic crisis. But here's the thing about statistics: they don't show human suffering. A mother in India suddenly can't afford cooking gas. A truck driver in Europe watches fuel prices double. A factory worker in South Korea loses their job after supply chains collapse. A family in Africa sees food prices become unbearable. This is the cruel reality of economic warfare. The battlefield is invisible. No explosions near your home. No fighter jets above your city. Yet your life changes anyway. Economic wars don't just destroy armies, they exhaust entire societies. And Iran knows this. That's why many analysts believe the Strait of Hormuz isn't just a military threat, it's psychological warfare against the global economy itself. Here's where things get even more dangerous. The Strait of Hormuz doesn't just affect America, it affects China massively. China imports huge amounts of Gulf oil. So if the strait closes, Beijing faces economic pain too. Europe suffers, India suffers, Japan suffers, which means one regional war suddenly becomes a global geopolitical crisis, and every major power is forced to respond. The United States wants freedom of navigation. China wants stable energy imports. Saudi Arabia wants regime survival. Israel wants security. Iran wants leverage. And every single side believes it's acting defensively. That's what makes geopolitical conflicts so terrifying. Nobody thinks they're the villain. We've entered a new age. Countries aren't just fighting with bombs anymore. They fight with sanctions, trade routes, technology, energy, currencies, economic warfare. And in this new battlefield, Iran discovered something powerful: geography itself can become a weapon. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just water, it's leverage. And leverage creates fear. That fear affects markets. Markets affect governments. Governments affect ordinary people. Which means a narrow waterway in the Middle East can influence elections, inflation, and political stability thousands of miles away. That's the terrifying interconnected reality of globalization. Now imagine you're an American president. If Iran threatens the strait, you can't ignore it. Because global energy stability is tied directly to global economic stability. But military intervention carries massive risks. One miscalculation could trigger regional war, and wars in the Middle East have a long history of becoming way more expensive than anyone expected. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. The scars are still there, so Washington faces a nightmare scenario: do nothing and risk economic chaos, or intervene and risk escalation. This is the Hormuz trap, and Iran knows it. Now, some experts argue Iran would never fully close the strait. Why? Because Iran also depends on oil exports, and because closing it could trigger overwhelming military retaliation. That's true, but here's the frightening part: Iran may not need a total closure. Even limited disruption can trigger panic. A few attacks, a few mines, a few drones. Sometimes perception alone can move markets. Remember, the global economy is built on confidence. Once confidence breaks, fear spreads fast. And in the digital age, panic travels at internet speed. Most people assume modern civilization is stable, permanent, unstoppable, but history tells a very different story. The global economy is incredibly fragile. One pandemic disrupted supply chains worldwide. One war in Europe reshaped energy markets. One attack in the Red Sea changed global shipping routes. Now imagine the Strait of Hormuz shutting down during an already unstable global economy. That's why analysts fear a domino effect: energy shock, inflation spike, market panic, debt crisis, political instability. And suddenly, governments everywhere face public anger, not because of local policies, but because of a narrow waterway thousands of miles away. That's globalization. In the end, the Strait of Hormuz gamble isn't really about oil, it's about desperation. Iran understands it can dominate the world, but it believes it can make the cost of isolating Iran too painful for everyone else. So the message becomes: if we suffer, the world suffers too. That's the gamble. And history shows that desperate nations often make dangerous decisions, especially when survival is on the line. Here's the frightening truth: the global economy has become so interconnected that one regional conflict can send shockwaves across the entire planet. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. We built a civilization dependent on fragile systems, fragile trade routes, fragile supply chains, fragile political stabilities, and somewhere between Iran and Oman lies one of the clearest reminders of that vulnerability: a narrow strip of water capable of shaking the world overnight. The Strait of Hormuz remains open tonight. Tankers still move, markets still trade, cities still glow with electricity. But beneath the surface, the tension remains. Because as long as the world depends on energy, Hormuz will remain one of the most dangerous pressure points on Earth. And one miscalculation could change everything. If you enjoyed these deep insights into geopolitics, subscribe Yam Upakoti channel for more videos on global power, economic warfare, and the hidden forces shaping our future. Because the next global crisis may already be unfolding beneath the headlines.